everyone. I'm psyched to be here today to chat with you all about resolving the paradox questions. By all means, GMAT Club just jumped in and let us know. By all means, feel free to jump into the chat as you guys begin to tune in. For those of you tuning in live, to just let us know where you're coming from, so we can kind of get a little bit of a collection of all the voices that we've got in today's live webinar. So as I mentioned, we're going to be talking a little bit about resolving the paradox. And I will say resolving the paradox is a question structure that was very heavily requested for this series. So I'm super psyched to be able to be chatting with you guys about it and really how we can simplify the question structure into simple terms so that we can make sense of them, make sure that we can route to correct answers, in many cases kind of preempt or pre-think the direction of these answers, and along the way avoid those pesky convincing wrong answers. And so with that in mind, the kind of foundation that I want to begin with here is I want to go ahead and talk about the connection between resolve the paradox questions, right? Where we're given two or more pieces of information that don't seem as though they align together, and we're tasked to bring a third piece of evidence, a third premise into the mix to see how to allow them to align together. And the key here is that with traditional strengthened questions, we are connecting the dots between a premise or premises and the corresponding conclusion. Basically, strengthening the sense it makes to connect the premises, to use the premises, or you may know as evidence, to draw the conclusion we've drawn. And we're doing virtually the same thing in the context of resolve the paradox questions. Here, we are connecting the dots between two or more premises. But the key here is that in either case, our task is more or less the same. We're bridging the gap between either premise and conclusion, or in this case, premise and premise. And so it's really important that we contextualize it and keep this in mind, because in most cases, when students go wrong with resolve the paradox questions, when they tend to run into trouble with the question structure, it tends to be because they'll think about the question structure as more or less a strengthened question to an extent, but they'll only address one of the premises, not the connection between them. And we want to make sure that we're answering the question that's being asked and paying attention to some of the skill sets that I've mentioned in earlier webinars, right? That we're paying attention to precision in language, that we're looking out to make sure that we're addressing precisely what that question is asking us. And so before we move into the formal questions that I have for us for today's webinar, I want to go ahead and have us go through a couple of sample kind of brainstorming questions. And yes, to that effect, this video will be available to watch later. So if you guys aren't able to tune into the full stream, all of this will be available to you. And I try to make a point of checking in on the comments. So by all means, feel free to jump into the comments, post the posting of this video, and I'd be happy to respond to any follow-up questions you have there as well. So with that in mind, I want us to brainstorm in what is actually probably a little more challenging than a true GMAT style question, because we're going to take a look at this without answer choices first. We're going to address some premises that don't seem like they work that nicely together, but see what additional information we could bring into the scheme to allow the information to align. So again, we are not strengthening or weakening the existence of the evidence. We're given factual information and we're saying, okay, if we have this factual information, what additional piece of factual information would allow this information to align or to make sense together? So we're going to contextualize this with a couple of brief examples. If I have a couple of pieces of evidence that say that scientists have discovered that lead paint can cause an array of health problems, particularly in young children, yet those same scientists have recommended that lead paint not be removed from walls in homes with small children. Someone go ahead and jump into the chat and help me brainstorm through. These two pieces of information don't seem like they align, they don't seem like they could overlap with one another, but what could I bring into the scheme? And maybe you have some familiarity with this topic. I've tried to choose something somewhat relatable, so that these two pieces of information could make sense together. What else could we bring into the scheme? What else, if true, might allow this information to make sense in unison? If scientists have discovered that lead paint causes health problems, particularly in young children, but the same folks are recommending, hey, if you've got lead paint, you'd better not remove it. Does anyone have thoughts for me? Yes, Shrey's exactly right here. So if the removal process itself is more dangerous than allowing it to exist in those small doses on the walls, yeah, if the removal is more harmful and it's less harmful in its current existence, then maybe that makes a little more sense. So again, it's taking information that seems to conflict, that seems like it can't quite mesh on first glance, and bringing in an additional premise, an additional piece of evidence that doesn't just explain one of the two elements, it allows them to work together. So let's look at a second example. Now I've got Sport Pro Sporting Goods, and Sporting Goods has begun replacing its existing machines, which produce state-of-the-art soccer balls for professional athletes, to different models that are able to complete more units faster, basically. However, business consultants have warned Sport Pro that this change will likely have a negative impact on their profits from the sale of this line of balls. So once again, now I've broadened things out a little bit, but I've still tried to keep it at a pretty relatable point. So if we're saying that we'll be able to produce more units faster, however, this will have a negative impact on profits, how might that be the case? And this is one that I've intentionally left a little open-ended so we can brainstorm a couple of different directions that this could potentially be resolved with an additional piece of information. So new machines can produce more units faster, but we expect it to have a negative impact on the profits. Good, so what about the demand? Do I have demand for more product, or is it gonna sit on a shelf and take up inventory costs, right? Yeah, maybe there's gonna be a difference in quality along the way. Or perhaps we're in a position to where the machines are costlier to run, or utilize more raw materials. Maybe there's more excess waste, more raw materials involved in the process. And as many of you kind of indirectly pointed out along the way, we want to make sure we note that the impact here that we're looking at concerns the profits, right? And so alongside anything that would impact that sales factor, we also want to speak to, in this case, anything that would impact the cost structure associated with the production of these balls. And this is a point that we're actually going to circle back to a little later in the lesson, where we want to make sure that we're paying close attention to precision in language, because whether we're looking at profits or just gross sales, right? Our gross revenue makes a big difference in many cases and can often make or break the conclusions we draw accordingly. So we'll want to make sure we're keeping that in mind. Very nicely done, guys. Let's jump into one more of these. So now I've got, and I will say you guys may recognize this because I stole a little bit of it from an official question. Hollywood Restaurant is replacing some of its standard tables with tall tables and stools. The restaurant already fills every available seat during its operating hours, and the change in seating arrangements will not result in an increase in the restaurant's seating capacity. However, the restaurant's management expects revenue to increase as a result of this seating change without any concurrent change in menu, prices, or operating hours. So this one's a little trickier, and I will say it is actually a formal GMAT question. But it's a little trickier because it's taken some of this brainstorming process we've gone through in the past two examples, and it's eliminated it from the running. It said, yeah, you know, all that stuff that first comes to mind around, well, maybe there's been a change in the prices, or maybe a change in operating hours, maybe a shift in capacity. Yeah, none of that's changed. Let's dig a little deeper. So if we're digging a little deeper, what else might potentially explain the fact that despite the fact that the change will not impact operating hours, capacity, menu, prices, or those operating hours? Good, yes, awesome. So again, maybe because you've seen this question before, maybe because it's kind of a relatable topic as well. Yeah, we've got those uncomfortable tall seats. I don't know about you guys, but we're probably not lingering in those chairs for quite as long. Yeah. So we've got this process by which, all right, well, if we've already accounted for prices and we've already accounted for the capacity, what else are we looking for? And the answer to that is turnover. If we can create more turnover, we can increase revenue despite all of these other elements remaining constant. So very nicely done. Thanks for jumping in, you guys. So the idea here is that we're taking our two or more premises and we're looking for an additional factual piece of information that connects the dots between them. So again, the proper answer to a resolve the paradox question, which is really just a subset of a regular old strengthened question, doesn't just address one of them or explain one of them. It addresses and allows for a connection between them. So with that in mind, I want us to take a look at this in the context of a full-fledged example. And I will say this is the one kind of 600 to 700 level question we're going to get the ball rolling with. From here on out, my remaining examples will be 700 plus. We're going to kind of push the dock a little bit, go through some challenging examples, and thanks guys for continuing to chime in. So what I'd like to do is, without providing too much context, I'd like to let you guys lead the way on this first full example. So I'm going to toss 2 minutes on the clock. And as you guys probably saw, if you didn't, we're going to repost the link. I do have a poll available for this, just so we're not giving everything away in the chat. We can keep our kind of collective responses more or less secret as we're moving through it, and I can get a better sense of how you're responding as a group. So please feel free to respond to the polls. I'm going to toss 2 minutes up, and then we're going to regroup and we're going to chat about this one together. So go ahead and take 2, dig in, and see if you can figure out which of the following, if true, most helps to explain why raisins contain more iron per calorie than do grapes. Go for it. All right, folks, so our 2 minutes are up. So if you haven't had the chance to respond in that polling, please feel free to go ahead and do so. Otherwise, let's go ahead and get a little bit of a conversation going. So we've got that raisins are made by drying grapes in the sun. Although some of the sugar is caramelized, nothing is added, and the only thing removed is water, and water contains no calories or nutrients. So the fact that raisins contain more iron per food calorie than grapes do is thus puzzling. Now, I will say, overwhelmingly, you guys chose the correct response here. So let's go ahead and talk about it, because we've got a couple of folks who are shifted to other ends of the spectrum here. And I want us to chat a little bit about why and how we can start to bridge that gap effectively. So if we're looking for something that explains the fact that raisins contain more iron per food calorie than grapes, despite the fact that nothing is added and the only thing removed is calorie-free water and nutrient-free water, we want to think about how this has the potential to impact the iron per food calorie ratio, right? So we've got this kind of iron over food calories. And this is where we want to pay very close attention to make sure we're answering the question that's being asked, because Answer choice A, which was the most frequently chosen wrong answer, says since grapes are bigger than raisins, it takes several bunches of grapes to provide the same amount of iron as a handful of raisins. And well, gosh, that seems to be a pretty true statement and even a somewhat relevant and on-topic statement. But does it address the iron to food calorie ratio? No. It addresses iron per volume. And what's tricky is that in many cases, some of our most convincing wrong answers will be answers that seem on topic, that seem true in nature according to the information, but do not directly answer the question being asked, or in this case, resolve the paradox being asked about. Whereas, if I look to this kind of iron to food calorie ratio, there are two ways that iron to food calorie ratio can change. Either my iron can go up, my iron can increase, which seems a little puzzling given the scenario since we're not adding anything, or my food calories can decrease given that same respective quantity of raisin grape material or matter. So with that in mind, if caramelized sugar cannot be digested and its calories don't count toward the food calorie content of raisins, doesn't this inherently just tell us that all other things being equal, this denominator is going to be going down a little bit? And if we toss just a smidge of quan into the mix, as our denominator decreases, the ratio itself becomes larger, right? It increases. And that precisely explains what we're looking for here. Now, what I note is that each of these wrong answers just addresses a different topic or a different question than the one being asked, right? Our first one spoke to volume. And volume wasn't what we were looking to. The third one says the body can absorb iron and other nutrients more quickly from grapes than raisins because of the high water content. Well, yeah, that may speak all good and well to the absorption rate, right? But that's not what we were asked about, nor is the availability that we see in answer choice D, or its combination with other foods. So pretty clearly, and I think we were set up such that, yeah, no one chose answer choice D or E, but we want to keep in mind that each of these somewhat convincing wrong answers addressed a different paradox or a different question than the one that was specifically being posed to us here. So we want to make sure we're paying attention to that precision in language and we're answering the question that's being asked. It's absolutely essential that we do so. So with that in mind, the big picture takeaway here, and it's one we'll be circling back to, is answering the question being asked. Now, it was a bit more straightforward in this example, kind of by design. So we're gonna push into a couple of more challenging questions that task us to take this distinction between what the paradox is addressing and what it isn't quite addressing, and answer choices that address perhaps only one element versus the paradox as a whole. So I'd like us to go ahead and do that in the context of this second question, and I will preface it and say this second question along with one more of these, they are GMAT prep questions, so just as a quick aside, if you're concerned with spoiling your GMAT prep experience, they were just too good to miss up on, so we're gonna go ahead and tackle them. I'm once again, without too much prefacing, gonna let you guys lead the way on this question. So let's go ahead and look at which of the following, if true, most helps to account for the drop in reclamation costs described. So I'm gonna reset the poll, so feel free to use that exact same link and go ahead and respond to me over the next 2 minutes, and then we're gonna circle back and talk about it. All right, folks, get those responses in if you have not already. I will say, as of a couple of moments ago, we were in a little more disagreement on this one. So I want to make sure we're taking the time. And I will say, not entirely surprising, this hits on a particular pitfall that is very common in GMAT critical reasoning, and then I want to make sure we address. So we're looking to account for the drop in reclamation cost described. So we've got 20 years ago, Balzania put in place regulations requiring operators to pay for reclamation of mined out land. Now, is it somewhat helpful to know what reclamation costs refer to? Potentially. However, I would encourage you to keep in mind that you could utilize context without that knowledge and be perfectly fine on this question. So since then, reclamation technology hasn't improved, yet the average cost for a surface coal mine being reclaimed today is only $4 per ton of coal that the mine produced, less than half of what it cost in the years immediately after the regulations took effect. So we want to look out for this disparity, for this paradox of information, to where we have a drop in reclamation costs, but the primary consideration that probably first comes to mind that would otherwise have explained that drop isn't the case. We haven't had any sort of improvement in technology. So we want something that allows these two pieces of information to make sense. We've got no improvement in technology, however, reclamation costs have declined. So in this case, we were a little more torn between answer choice B and answer choice C, which is not unusual. Statistically speaking, with this question, it's where students tend to linger. So if we look to the two major premises we've been given here, right? We need something, and now everyone was shifting their answers along the way. We need something that helps address for us, the connection between the lack of improvement in technology, but the improvement in or decline in those reclamation costs. So if we speak to something like answer choice A, even after they began requiring surface mine operators to pay reclamation costs, coal mines continued to be less expensive to operate than in almost any other country. That's completely out of scope, totally irrelevant to us here. The comparison to the other country does not account for the improvement despite the stagnation in technology. So A is definitely pretty clearly out, and no one chose it, so not surprising. But if we look to B, in the 20 years since the regulations took effect, the use of coal as a fuel has declined from the level it was at in the previous 20 years. So the use of coal, so basically the population size that we're looking at, should that impact average reclamation costs? Should the population size impact our average, all other things being equal? Anyone have thoughts for me there? So if we're speaking to the potential disparity that we're trying to address between no improvement in technology but improvement in reclamation costs, having a different size or lowering the size of the fuel that we utilize, yeah, it doesn't directly impact the average. We've been given average reclamation costs, and the population size does not impact that average. So we want to be really careful about, and you guys probably saw a sneak peek from the slide that I accidentally fast forwarded to, about the difference between when we're given hard values versus scalable relationships. Things like our percents, our ratios, our averages. So with that in mind, B's out of the mix as well. But if we speak to C, mine operators have generally ceased surface mining in the mountainous areas of Balzania because reclamation costs per ton of coal produced are particularly high for those mines. Well, in this case, if it's particularly high for certain mines, then all we've done is we've cut out the use of mines that are particularly or above average in expense. Does that have the potential to impact our average? So does that have the potential to impact our average? If I have basically a decrease in the most expensive of my reclamation costs? Absolutely, right? If I take away those high-end fringe cases, then I would expect my average overall to shift down despite the lack of change in technology. So this absolutely explains not only the decrease, but the pairing of the decrease with the lack of technological improvement. We've found our answer. So very nicely done, those of you who chose answer choice C. And D&E didn't happen to be all that convincing for you guys, but to really briefly address them, whether surface mines continued to produce coal at a lower total cost than underground mines, well, the total cost does not directly impact the argument we're making. The argument we're making concerns specifically reclamation costs, so that guy's out of scope as well. And whether a greater percentage of the coal mined comes from surface mines also doesn't matter to us because we are speaking specifically to surface mined reclamation costs. So once again, we're outside of our scope, and as many of you noted, we've arrived at answer choice C. So once again, there are a couple of big picture takeaways that we want to make sure we have on our radar anytime we're encountering this question structure. We want to look out for precision in language, and we want to look out for cases where wrong answers might answer a different question than the one that's been asked. They might address one, but not both or all of the premises, right? They may explain why we've had an increase, but not explain how the two align with one another, right? And they might seem relevant, but fall outside of the scope. So it's things like answer choices D and E, for anyone who may have been initially convinced by them, seem relevant, they seem on topic, but they fall outside of the scope of what is specifically being addressed. Now, by all means, as we go through big picture takeaways, if you have any lingering questions around any of these, jump into the chat. I'd be happy to address them. And we'll be sure that we're saving a couple of moments at the end of the lesson for just general Q&A. So by all means, if anything isn't feeling 100% confident as we move through, particularly as we move into a couple of more challenging examples, jump in and let me know. Otherwise, let's go ahead and move on to our next example. So our next example is once again asking us which of the following best explains the apparent discrepancy above, and without too much ado, I'm going to let you guys have at it. Take 2 minutes, polls will be reset for you, and then we will chat about it. All right, guys, let's go ahead and take a look. So our new paradox to be addressed concerns the athletic footwear industry. So we've got, it was revolutionized years ago by the introduction of expensive products backed by celebrity athlete endorsements and sophisticated brand marketing on radio and television. I'll say, I would argue that this first piece of information is more or less context, right? It's there to paint a more flowery picture, but it doesn't directly impact the connection between the two out of alignment premises that I have in my original stimulus. So we've got, since then, it has become accepted that companies simply cannot compete in the industry without a great deal of media exposure. So we need media exposure. However, the most popular new brand of athletic footwear in the last year is not advertised on radio and television and positions its product as half the price, just as good. So with that in mind, I will say, while you all collected primarily around the correct answer, there was once again quite a bit of dispersion. And we're going to chat about it. I will say answer choice C tends to be the most convincing wrong answer. We're going to chat about why. And we've got a couple of folks lingering elsewhere into some other admittedly convincing wrong answers. So if we're looking to address how, despite the fact that it has become accepted that companies can't compete without a great deal of media exposure, however, the most popular new brand is not advertised on radio and television and positions its product as more of a bargain deal. We're not looking to just explain why they are more popular. That's an incomplete answer to a resolve the paradox question. We want something that tells us how these two factual pieces of information, we need media exposure to be successful, and they haven't advertised on radio and television, to align and make sense together. So with that in mind, if I looked at something like answer choice A, the new brand of footwear is constructed along the same lines as the products made by more expensive brands. Well, them being constructed similarly certainly does not explain, it doesn't bridge the gap between they need media exposure and they are not advertised on radio and television. This one's pretty irrelevant, right? Doesn't bridge the gap at all. And if we look to B, the new footwear brand has several celebrity spokespeople who are not athletes. Well, having celebrity spokespeople who are not athletes, does it address both elements here? The fact that they are the most popular, despite not advertising on radio and television, and necessitating some sort of media exposure to be successful? Not really. I could make a case to where maybe it helps to explain the popularity, but it doesn't bridge the gap between the two. We're not trying to negate one and say the other one's the only one that matters. We need to make both of these pieces of information make sense together. So with that in mind, B's out of the mix as well. So let's talk about D, because overwhelmingly those of you who did not choose D chose C. So most of the new brand's customers have come from personal recommendations. Personal recommendations could certainly address the popularity, right? Personal recommendations could say, all right, well, they're using word of mouth to be successful. But it goes completely counter to the additional premise we were given in the STEM that told us that they need media exposure, right? Companies cannot compete without a great deal of media exposure. So this one's out as well. But if you guys recognize the gap in the first place, I will say this question's pretty ripe for preempting. We can think about what direction our answer choice will need to go. And if we're saying media exposure is necessary, they don't advertise on radio and television, what's the gap in reasoning? Just in your own words, if you want to go ahead and jump into the chat. What's the gap in reasoning between saying that they need media exposure to be competitive and they don't advertise on radio and television? Because on first glance, we could almost read through that and be fooled into thinking that those two things are saying the same thing. But they're not precisely, and certainly don't have to be. If I think about it, there is a great deal more that could encompass media exposure outside of advertising on radio and television. So is it possible to always see the correct answer to be the one that includes both? If you mean to kind of pre-think or anticipate, it will not always jump out at you. However, I will say if you're building on your critical reasoning foundations and skill set, depending on the question structure, with these foundational core question types, so things like strengthen, weaken, assumption, evaluate, and their subsets, it is worth the time invested to pause for a few moments before analyzing the answer choices to see if the gap obviously jumps out to you. Because if it does, it keeps you from being too caught up in some of those convincing wrong answers and will tend to steer you toward the correct answer, even if it's drastically different in wording. Right? I will say despite the fact that it will not always jump out at you, It won't. It is worth the couple of moments invested to take pause and say, can I identify the existing gap, and what sorts of things might I need to address that? So really, really great question. So yeah, in this case, we've got this situation, and if you were with me in some of my past webinars, you know this kind of throwback takeaway. We have this situation to where they've conflated media exposure and advertising on radio and television as more or less the same in meaning. But they're not necessarily. That's exactly right. We could have several other ways of achieving media exposure outside of this radio and television advertising. So sure, let's circle back to C, because I will say it's an extremely convincing wrong answer, certainly, but it is definitively wrong. So answer choice C, that most of the new brand's customers have come from personal recommendations, certainly addresses why they might have popularity, but it doesn't allow the facts that they have popularity to align with the fact that they need media exposure to be competitive. It explains one of the elements of the paradox, but it doesn't explain how the two align together. And that's what we're looking to accomplish with Resolve the Paradox questions. And actually, similarly to what we're trying to accomplish with strengthen questions, we're not just trying to address what strengthens the conclusion, we're trying to address what strengthens the connection between premise and conclusion, right? What allows it to make sense to use that piece of evidence to draw that particular conclusion? Is that making a little more sense? The fact that answer choice C addresses the popularity but does not address the factual piece of information that we were given, that in order to be competitive, we need a great deal of media exposure. Yeah, there we go. So absolutely on the right track here. So in this case, if we look to something like answer choice D, we've falsely conflated, or the argument has falsely conflated this media exposure and radio and television advertising, but there are many other elements that could comprise media exposure outside of paid advertising, right? So with that in mind, with answer choice D has told us the company's novel marketing approach has been repeatedly covered on several popular news shows. So if the company's approach has been repeatedly covered on news shows, this gives us a great deal of reasoning why we could have media exposure without paying for radio and television advertising. So it absolutely resolves the paradox at hand. My apologies there, I know. I get a little more excited about this stuff than most folks, so I'll take it down a notch on you guys. May have had a cup too much of coffee this morning, but D, as many of you guys mentioned, is absolutely on the right track here. So again, if we circle into E, which I don't believe too many of you all were all that convinced by, yeah, so we're in good shape here. But last year, the new footwear brand had sales that were less than half of the sales of the leading brand, actually kind of exaggerates in a way the paradox, right? Or puts us in a position to where it kind of weakens one of the premises, but it certainly doesn't address the connection or create a connection between them. So yeah, E is pretty clearly out of the running as well. So if we're circling back, and again, this is something I mentioned really briefly in one of my previous webinars, but in critical reasoning as a whole, we want to look out for cases where two potentially different in meaning elements are posed as synonymous, right? They're posed as the same in meaning. So with that in mind, we'll want to look out for cases, and especially in cases where you read through the argument and you say, well, gosh, it kind of seems like it's just saying the same thing twice. We'll want to take a step back and look out for precision in language. Look out for cases to where we may see a potential difference in wording. It may not appear all that relevant, but if we dig in, we can find that the difference in language expresses a very clear difference in meaning that needs to be addressed. In this case, by noting, hey, we've got other potential kind of media exposure opportunities that aren't necessarily paid advertising on radio and television. Awesome. So can we eliminate C as it uses most when running out of time? Ooh, so I wouldn't. And I will say there are cases where looking out for what we'll consider extreme language, it's actually a really awesome question. Looking out for extreme language can be a really powerful tool, particularly when we're looking at question types like inference questions, particularly when we're looking at things in reading comprehension like author would agree, disagree. So there are question styles in which I would be especially scrutinous of extreme language, but I would not use it as an immediate means for elimination, even when in a hurry, because as you guys are probably familiar, if you've jumped into a great deal of practice, the GMAT does like to test that's the exception to the rule in many cases, so that they're burning students who are too heavily utilizing pattern recognition to be successful. So we want to make sure that we're taking a step back and that we're looking for the opportunity that we address kind of the relevancy and how it impacts the argument, or in this case, the combination of premises, without too heavily utilizing that pattern recognition. So the short answer there to your point is I would be suspicious of extreme language, particularly with question styles that, imply this must be true parameter, right? So for inference questions, our correct conclusion is the one that is guaranteed to be true based on the information. In that case, in many cases, we may fail to meet that parameter if we are too extreme in language. In a case like a resolve the paradox question, there isn't necessarily a great deal of indication just based on extreme language that an answer is more or less likely to be the correct answer. But that's a really awesome question. And by all means, as you guys have additional questions, please feel free to jump in with them. So we want to look out for cases where we've conflated two things as the same in meaning, even though they're not necessarily. So with that in mind, I've got two more for you guys. I will preface this and say both of these do appear on official GMAT practice tests. So keep that in mind. If you want to keep from spoiling the practice test, they do appear there, but they're really awesome questions that I want us to take a moment to break down. And if you have already seen them, I think they're worth the conversation around because there's a lot of cool stuff we can take away from them. So we've got, which of the following, if true, does the most to explain the apparently surprising result? So same question structure, slightly different wording. Let's go ahead and take two, and then we're going to circle back on it. All right, so this one's been a pretty fun one to follow in the polls. It looks like we've got a little bit of indecision. We've got quite a bit of dispersion. So let's make sure that we key in on where our opportunities for improvement stand according to what convincing wrong answer you may have been convinced by. So if we keep this in mind, we're looking for which of the following explains the apparently surprising result. So once again, resolve the paradox structure, though the language of the question stem can change a little here and there. And we've got a major consumer electronics maker with a sizable decline in sales revenue for its most recent fiscal year. This result appears surprising because retailers report that although their overall sales were considerably lower than in the previous year, their sales revenue from these models, this particular company, actually grew, largely thanks to some innovative and popular models that they introduced. So this is another case where I will say anticipation, or anticipating the direction of the answer, at the very least the gap in reasoning here, could be extremely helpful to us. So if we're looking at this, we have a decline in sales revenue. So Genoma has an overall decline in sales revenue, despite the fact that electronics retailers report that their revenue from this specific brand has increased. So revenue of the electronic retailers has increased, specifically for this brand. So if we keep these two elements in mind, and I will say this is a case where we want to consider the third element, that in general, right, their overall sales did follow a trend of being considerably lower, but their sales of Genoma had actually shot up. So if I'm thinking about this, just in your own words, and again, it may not jump out at you, but you'll want to make sure you save the space to see if it does. So in your own words, what's the gap here, right? What's potentially missing, or what do we need to bridge between the fact that overall sales revenue for Genoma has gone down, but sales revenue in electronic retailers has increased? Good, that's exactly right. So total revenue must not equate to the revenue in the electronic retail stores. So that tells me they must have some other form of revenue that is suffering. That has to be true in order to bridge the gap between these two. So this is a case to where pre-thinking, to where trying to anticipate the direction of, at the very least, the gap, if not what has the potential to bridge the gap, can be extremely helpful. So, all right, if we keep this in mind, let's talk about Ish, right? During the period, consumer electronics retailers sold remaining units of Genoma's superseded models at prices that were deeply discounted. So they sold them at deeply discounted prices. If we are already told that electronic retailers have had an increase in sales, in revenue from their Genoma models, is the cost at which they sell them relevant to us? So what needs to be true to bridge the gap? In this case, if I'm saying that overall Genoma's sales revenue has decreased, but their revenue at electronic retailers has increased, this tells me there must be some other form of revenue that has the potential to be negatively impacted by this trend. Is that making sense? Jump in and let me know. If not, I'd be happy to delve further into that. So, circling back to Shrey's point, right? During the period, consumer electronics retailers sold remaining units at discounted prices. If we are already told that Genoma revenue at electronic retailers has increased, does this have the potential to bridge the gap? No, right? It doesn't decrease. It doesn't address their overall decline in sales revenue. If their decline in sales revenue has increased at electronic retailers, regardless of whether it was more units at a discounted price or fewer units at a higher price, that actually doesn't matter to us if what we're speaking to is revenue as opposed to elements like profit. So I could see where a case could be made to your point, Shrey, and I will say it is a frequently chosen wrong answer. If we were speaking to elements like profit, if we had a slightly different structure or situation in mind, but here we're speaking to revenue and we were already told that the revenue increased in electronic retail stores and has decreased overall. So we need something that tells us that they've got revenue coming from another source that is suffering at this time. E doesn't address that. However, if we circle through and we look for opportunities, all right, well, because of the need to educate the public, their advertising spending was higher. We actually had several folks who chose answer choice A. Can someone talk to me on a very similar line to the one we've just been speaking about why answer choice A doesn't make sense to us here? Anyone have any thoughts for me on what is problematic about, because of the need to educate the public about its new model's capabilities, Genoma's advertising spending was higher than normal over the period? Why doesn't that address the paradox in this case? Because a slightly different structure it might have. But we're talking about revenue, right? Sales revenue is what we're talking about up top, and sales revenue is what we're talking about below. So yes, that's exactly right. Marketing costs are not included in that revenue. And we want to pay close attention. I mentioned we'd be circling back to this point. We want to pay close attention for the potential difference in meaning and in application between profit and revenue. That's exactly right, guys. Thanks for jumping in there. So A is pretty clearly out of the mix, though it's convincing if we're not paying close attention to those details. And if we speak to D, for the period at issue, their major competitors reported declines in revenue that were, in percentage terms, greater than Genoma's. So whether or not other companies suffered more than they suffered doesn't explain this paradox between a decrease in overall sales revenue versus an increase in revenue at electronic retailers, right? It doesn't have the potential to bridge that gap just by saying they're not doing as bad. So this one's out of the mix as well. And if we speak to C, a significant proportion of their revenue comes from making components for other consumer electronics manufacturers. So let's talk about C. I will say overwhelmingly, especially now that I've nixed a couple of the originally chosen answer choices, you guys have shifted over to answer choice C. So let's talk about how this explains the paradox. We have a significant proportion of their revenue coming from a different source, and on top of that, we were told that overall the trend has been a decline, right? So if overall the trend has been a decline, and a decent portion of their sales is to other companies who are experiencing this decline, doesn't that give us reason to believe they've got a different avenue of sales and that avenue of sales is suffering? That's exactly what we were looking for here. And if we circle into D, right, unlike some of its major competitors, they have no lines of business outside of consumer electronics. Well, no, we specifically needed an element to where they have some other line of sales, and that other line of sales is suffering. All right, questions, comments, concerns for me on this one. I will say there was quite a bit more dispersion among the answers on this particular case, so I want to make sure everyone's feeling really comfortable. We wanted to make sure we addressed specifically, utilizing that precision in language, what the paradox was here, and we addressed that particular paradox. So sales, not profit. Overall versus electronic retailers. What would need to be the case in order to bridge that gap? Well, they'd have to have some other source of revenue that's a pretty substantial one, right? A pretty notable one that has some reason to believe we'd have some sort of decline. And that's precisely what answer choice C gives us. So our correct answer must address not only one of the components, but how they align together. So thought C is best, but aren't we mixing inventory of other companies with revenues? Keep in mind that they're being paid for their sales of goods to other companies, right? If they make components for other consumer electronics manufacturers, they're making money. That's a revenue stream for them. But the idea here is that if that makes up a substantial portion of their revenue stream and other companies, basically their customers, are suffering during this time, we have reason to believe that their customers will purchase through this stream at a lower amount. So E is basically out because even if we sell 10 items per month with, yeah, exactly, it doesn't make a difference to the sales revenue. That's exactly right, yeah. All right, any other lingering questions for me here? Did I address the point around inventory versus other companies? Because we are still speaking specifically to their sales revenue. We're just looking at another stream. So what level would we categorize this question? This is a 700 level question. So I've stepped us up from about 600 to 650 level in the first question or so into 700 plus in these final ones. So they are meant to be challenging questions. And I will say there are actually several ways that GMAT Club can be a very valuable resource in pinpointing specific revenue type questions and paradox questions. So we have a tag, there's a tag specifically for resolve the paradox questions. And in many cases, if you find a question that you like, you can search out similar questions using the kind of tag at the bottom of the screen that gives you the opportunity to seek out similar questions. Yeah, so in this case, the second part is kept constant. I'm not sure that I understand what you mean. I want to make sure that I'm correctly addressing your question. So our overall sales revenue has decreased. The revenue from electronic retailers has increased, right? It actually grew thanks to these innovative methods. So I'm not sure I know what portion, unless you mean this element itself, right? So if a significant portion comes from making components for other consumer electronics manufacturers, and those manufacturers are declining in the necessity for their goods, then we're running into trouble there. So how are we addressing both parts in C? Because it explains why their revenue from electronic retailers could decrease. However, the company as a whole is following this overall trend downward in terms of revenue of electronic goods as a whole. Is that making a little more sense? Because I will say it's a tricky one, but it's a really good one, and it has some common themes that overarch into many other critical reasoning questions you could expect to see in official materials. If not, let me know. If so, if I don't have any lingering questions specific to this structure, cool, awesome. Then we want to make sure, and I've mentioned these to a point, but I want to circle back to them, that we look out for potential differences between sales or revenue versus profit. And you guys did a really great job of chiming in on precisely that point. These kind of hard values versus those scalable relationships, which I mentioned earlier, right? In general, we want to make sure that we're on the lookout for the type of data we've been given on data-driven questions. Are we given something that scales up and down with the population size, like a percent or a ratio, or are we given a hard value? And is that indicative of the conclusion we're trying to draw, or the other premise along the way in this case? Or could I interpret it somewhat differently from the way that first meets the eye? And that actually takes us into the final question we're going to be covering. And again, as I mentioned, we want to be on the lookout for terminology between premise and premise. We want to look out for cases where they conflate two things as the same in meaning when they're just not necessarily. So with that in mind, I've got one more for us. It's a little differently structured. And once again, we are looking at an official question, but I want to see how you guys fare on this next one. Once again, I'm going to give you 2 minutes to do so. So go ahead and dig in with, in light of the background information, which of the following, if true, can account for fact 1 and fact 2, both being true of the submissions to this year's Barbizon Film Festival? Go ahead, take 2, and then we will chat about it. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and hop back on screen. I will say we are in the first position over the course of this set of questions where the correct answer did not win out in the polls. At least when last I checked, it may have shifted a bit since then. But if we're looking to account for fact one and fact two both being true, so this is very directly going to be, the question aligns with an MBA application process. Very directly, right? We want to look to how these two facts could potentially align. And very, very specifically, again, when we speak to precision in language, what would need to be the case in order for that to happen? And I will say, a little less overwhelmingly at this point, but overwhelmingly, you guys were lingering between either answer choice B or answer choice E. And I will say, that's not unusual. The convincing wrong answer between these is consistently the most convincing wrong answer, whether I'm working with one-on-one students or in cases where I've posed this to a group in the past. So let's go ahead and talk about it. And I will say, yes, this is notably the most challenging question in the set. That's why I've saved it for last, but it's a good one. So we've got each film submitted to this film festival was submitted in one of 10 categories, and for each category there was a panel that decided which submitted films to accept. So pretty straightforward situation at hand. On first glance, we're given a little bit of context here, and now we're told that within each category the rate of acceptance for domestic films was the same as that for foreign films. So our rate is the same for domestic as for foreign within each category. So that tells me that in a particular category, neither foreign nor domestic films were more likely to be accepted, right? So yeah, Shrey's on the right track here. I like it. So fact two tells us the overall rate of acceptance of domestic films was significantly higher. And once again, we're speaking to the rate. So if we are looking to bridge the gap, once again, we're in a situation where I can think about, okay, what would have to be true in order for these elements to align, right? Because in this case, if the rate of acceptance was the same within each category, but the overall rate of acceptance was higher for domestic than for foreign, if we just brainstorm through, if we thought about realistically what might allow this to make sense, certainly we would need to be in a position where each of these categories does not have the same rate and we don't have the same distribution among the categories. Both of those things that have to be true, and only one of these answer choices addresses that. So let's start by talking a little bit about our convincing wrong answers. So in each category, the selection panel was composed of filmmakers, and some selection panels included no foreign filmmakers. So having potential selection bias in our panel does not address the difference between the same rate of acceptance within categories, but a different overall rate of acceptance. And so A is pretty clearly out. And if we speak to B, we've had a couple of folks chime in on this point. Significantly more domestic films than foreign films were submitted to the festival. Like I mentioned with this idea of values versus scalable relationships, does the size of domestic versus foreign films impact the difference between the rates? Does the size of each group impact the potential that they could have the same rate within categories, but different rates overall? Nope. Once again, we're in a position to where we're trying to combine value-based information with scalable relationship-based information, and that's not something we can do. Answer choice B, despite seeming convincing on first glance, does not align this apparent discrepancy. And if we continue on, in each of the past 3 years, the overall acceptance rate was higher for foreign than domestic, an outcome that had upset some domestic filmmakers. Again, we're in a similar situation to answer choice A, to where, maybe this could explain some sort of kind of selection bias or overcompensation for why the overall rate of domestic films was higher than of foreign films, but it certainly doesn't address the difference we're seeing between these two facts. So that one's out of the running as well. And if we look to D, right? So what if 2 out of 10 were accepted for domestic and 1 out of 5 was accepted for foreign? So keep in mind, 2 out of 10 and 1 out of 5 is the same acceptance rate, right? Now, if, for instance, to your point, if, for instance, fact 2 had told us that more domestic films were accepted than foreign films, then what you're saying would absolutely make sense. If a higher quantity majority of domestic films were accepted, right, then absolutely what you're saying makes sense. But keep in mind, we're comparing rate to rate, and it doesn't align that difference between rate and rate. So 3 out of 10 were accepted for domestic and 1 out of 5 was accepted for foreign. So keep in mind though, we need to address the difference between the rate individually among categories and the overall rate. And the population size of these categories does not do that. Is that making a little more sense? So we need to have, if all of the categories had the same rate of acceptance, there is no feasible way that we could see a difference category to category versus overall. If the foreign versus domestic were evenly distributed between each category, even if they had differences, right, then we would not be able to see this overlap in outcome. We would not be in a position where both of these things could make sense together. We need to be in a position where there's a difference, right, in terms of the acceptance rates across different categories, and we need to know that the dispersion isn't the same. But in this case, the population size actually doesn't matter to us. And I'm going to express that in just a moment, because we could be in a position where the population sizes are precisely the same or drastically different and still have alignment between these two statements. So with that in mind, the number of films to be selected in each category was predetermined, but in no category was it required that the acceptance rate should equal. It may not have been a requirement, but it was a factual outcome we already saw, so that's pretty irrelevant to us as well. But as a couple of you guys mentioned, if we speak to answer choice E, most foreign films, unlike most domestic films, were submitted in categories with high prestige but correspondingly low rates of acceptance. This is telling me that in terms of kind of weighted averages, we've got more of a shift of these foreign films toward categories that have lower rates of acceptance, whereas our domestic films are maybe in less competitive categories. So if I look at a case like my answer choice E, right? If I have for my foreign and domestic films, let's hypothetically move through this as if we do have the same population size. Again, this will work regardless of whether we have the same population size or drastically different population sizes. If I'm in a position to where let's say I have 1,100 for each, and my category 1 was a 1% acceptance, right? Very, very low acceptance rate. And abundantly more of my foreign films applied where the acceptance rate was extremely low. Let's say 1,000 of my foreign films applied here, thus just 10 of them were accepted. And let's say that only 100, right, of my domestic films applied in this low acceptance category, and 1 was accepted. Well, certainly the acceptance rate is the same within the category, right? But that doesn't necessarily tell me that the overall acceptance rate is the same. So I'm just looking at this in the context of 2 categories. Keep in mind, we can iterate this out to all 10. But if category 2 has a notably different acceptance rate, let's say they let in 50% of our folks, right? 50% of the films are accepted. And only about the remaining 100 apply here. Well then, yeah, we've got another 50 here, but that gets me, right, to a total accepted of only 60 out of this total of 1,100. Whereas, if we've now shifted it to where I've got a whole bunch of this domestic left to be attributed to the higher acceptance category 2, well, if category 2 has the remaining 1,000 here, right, then it's got a whole 500. And again, the acceptance rate is still the same within the category, but we're gonna see here where this 501, right, is drastically different in terms of the overall acceptance rate. Is that making sense to everyone? Again, this would be the same whether we had the same overall value or different overall values, but what we needed is we needed a difference in acceptance rates across categories, and we needed the foreign films to be clustered around lower acceptance rate categories, and that's exactly what we've done with this illustration. Any questions for me there? Yeah, so Shrey reiterated the point with a little more context, right? If domestic ones were in a variety of categories that maybe weren't quite as prestigious, but international ones were just in really famous, really prestigious, really low acceptance rate categories, then we could be in a position where, despite the fact that we have the same rates within the categories, we have a drastically different overall acceptance rate. All right. Questions, comments, concerns on this particular example? I will admit it is a challenging one, but it deals really heavily with what it is we're trying to accomplish with Resolve the Paradox questions and with where data can creep its way into the mix. So why we eliminated D? Sure, let's circle back to it. So if we go to D, the number of films to be selected in each category was predetermined, but it wasn't required that the acceptance rate of foreign films should equal that of domestic films. Whether or not it was a requirement actually really doesn't matter to us in this case because we already have the factual piece of information that it was the same within each category, but notably different overall. Is that making sense? We already have, we're not trying to make, break, weaken, impact the truth of our statements. We're saying, I already know these statements are true, right? If I know that these are true statements, if I know these are facts, and I bring an additional fact into the mix, does it bridge the gap and allow these two pieces of information to make sense together? Is that making a little more sense? Jump in and let me know. If not, I'd be happy to address it further. But again, it all boils down to kind of the root of what it is we're trying to get at with this question structure as a whole. So with that in mind, again, we can very briefly, whether you formally laid it out or you just kind of conceptualized it and said, hey, this will depend really heavily on the dispersion among categories and the individual rates in those categories, then conceptualizing how the data may be a little different than first meets the eye allows us to arrive at the only truly relevant and correct conclusion in this particular case. All right, so with that in mind, this is another throwback takeaway from one of my previous webinars if you guys happen to have tuned in. We want to make sure we look out for how data can be inherently a little different from what first meets the eye and be scrutinous of that data. And if we do so, we can look out for cases to where it may not express what first meets the eye, or it may express what we're looking for, even if it took us a bit to get there. So how to save time on such questions? Sure, that's a really great question because I will say, this is inherently probably a bit more time consuming. And I will say, even if we look to the statistics, whether it's official statistics or GMAT Club statistics on this question, it does sit above the 2-minute mark, I believe, for this particular question. And so, you know, it is certainly a case to where I would reiterate and reinforce that all questions are not meant to take precisely the same amount of time. It's really important that we keep that in mind. And you'll want to make sure that your pacing strategies are set up accordingly. If you're pacing yourself to where in practice tests and on test day, you're setting a 2-minute timer and stopping yourself precisely when you've hit 2 minutes or precisely when you've hit 1.8 minutes for verbal, you're probably not doing yourself a lot of good in the long run in terms of maximizing the value of that time across the section. So I will say, if this question in particular took you a little closer to the 2.5-minute mark, that is not make or break in terms of your overall pacing. You'll want to make sure that you're leveraging opportunities to, let's say, identify cases to where you're investing time that isn't necessarily adding as much value in your sentence correction process or in how you route through reading comprehension, basically whittling away at time that isn't adding value so that if you are in a position where you need to lay out the data a little bit and a couple of questions along the way take you a little longer than average, it doesn't hurt you in your overall pacing. So you'll want to make sure when we speak to pacing, yes, being able to look at a question like this and be familiar enough that we treat it almost like a data sufficiency question and stop once we recognize that the dispersion of the question of the categories and the individual rates within the categories have the potential to really drastically impact these two statements and whether or not they align. I know I've arrived at the correct answer. Now, if you needed to formally lay out an example, yeah, maybe that'll be a little more time consuming, and that's where I would allow yourself the opportunity to dig into questions like these, even if they take you a little longer than the average question. And then, whether it's through formal error logging or just really diligent reflection, making sure that you identify in the processes that you take through questions what time isn't adding active value, that's promoting correct answers, that's moving you closer to your goal score, and whittling away from there, because you'll be better served doing so, especially on high-level questions, than trying to give yourself a precise cutoff on every single question and not allow yourself to grow in the process on questions that do initially challenge you a bit. So hopefully that addresses your point. But passage and a bit of pre-thinking feels like it will make one slower. Yes, this is a huge point. And I will say I get a little repetitive to this point, but it is one of the single most valuable pieces of advice I could give in terms of success, particularly in verbal, but as a whole on the GMAT, is that the GMAT is not meant to be a calculation test. It's not meant to be a memorization test. It is meant to be, at its core, a critical thinking test, which means that as questions become more challenging, they don't become terribly more content-driven or more obscure. They become more challenging to recognize what the question is asking you to do in its simplest terms and what the path to the answer looks like. And alongside that, with verbal, in many cases, we pair that with the fact that on high-level questions, in many cases, our correct answer is a little less punchy. It's not quite using the phrasing or terminology we thought we were looking for, and the incorrect answers inch a little closer to something that sounds convincing. But if we apply the same strategies and we fine-tune them well enough, we should be in a position, especially if we are front-loading the time on the analysis, taking the time on the front end to recognize what the question's truly asking you and what information it's tasking you to leverage. It keeps us from getting caught up in convincing wrong answers. It keeps us from having to go back and forth between answer choices over and over, and that tends to be where students consistently kill the most time. And it puts us in a position to recognize the correct answer even when it's a little less specifically kind of emphasized in the way you were looking for. So to do such questions, what source should we select on GMAT Club Tag? So this is an official question, so you can certainly feel free to utilize just the official questions if that's what you're looking to practice. I would encourage you, and I don't mean this negatively at all, because there's some great source questions out there. I would encourage you, as you utilize the tag page on GMAT Club, I think it's really well structured in this regard, to utilize reputable sources. So sources that you know create high quality questions. If a question says other, please specify as the source. I generally steer clear, just because, given that we have the nature of a forum where I have found that the consistency of questions tends to be a little different when the source is not mentioned. Right? So, but if you are looking to choose specifically official guide questions or specifically GMAT prep questions, as this question is sourced, that would be how to do so. But in terms of like the data-driven nature of the questions, those are spread more or less across different question structures. So the best thing you could do is find a question you like and search similar questions, or you could be in a position to where if you're looking to specifically utilize Resolve the Paradox questions, you can do so by choosing the Resolve the Paradox tag. So can we explain again how to eliminate D? Sure, let's talk about it. So with answer choice D, the number of films to be selected in each category was predetermined, but in no category was it required that the acceptance rate of foreign films should be equal to that of domestic films. Whether or not it was a requirement does not matter to us here. It doesn't connect the dots between these two factual pieces of information because we were already told that the rate of acceptance for domestic and foreign were the same within each category. We need something that lets us know. We need something about the dispersion of these categories and the rates of these categories that has the potential to create a difference between individual rates of acceptance and overall rate of acceptance, and only answer choice E does so. Does that address your question? If not, feel free to jump back in and we'll chat more about it. But by all means, this actually begins to round out the questions that I have for us on the docket over the course of today's lesson. So again, look for how data is a little different than first meets the eye. And we'll want to keep in mind that if we want to simplify this idea of what Resolve the Paradox questions are really getting at, we're rooting our kind of toolkit the exact same way we do our strengthened questions. We can treat them in a similar regard to how we look at strengthened questions, because all we're really looking to do is to bridge the gap now between two or more premises as opposed to a premise and a conclusion. So the rate of the submission caused the difference. Yeah, so the differing rates across categories and the differing dispersion across categories is the only thing that had the potential to give us a difference between the within each category rates and the overall rate. That's exactly correct. All right, so with that in mind, quick recap before we do any sort of general Q&A that you guys have for me. So by all means, if you have questions, jump them in the chat. I'd be happy to answer things on screen for the next couple of moments, and I'll hang in the chat to answer any lingering questions you have for me as well. We want to make sure that we bridge the gap between premises in the same way that we would between premise and conclusion with traditional strengthened questions. We also want to make sure we look out for those unduly conflated terms that are posed as the same in meaning, but aren't necessarily. We want to ensure that we're answering the question or the situation that's being addressed, right? We're resolving the actual paradox that exists, not presenting something that's maybe true, but not relevant to the situation at hand. And we want to keep in mind that our correct answer has to bridge the gap between premises, not just strengthen or explain one of them. And this tends to be the most commonly overlooked concept that I want to make sure we're keeping in mind. All right, so where can we get such level of questions? Oh yeah, so that was, yeah, I believe one that I addressed there is, again, you can utilize whether it's the question style, the difficulty level. This is a 700 plus level question. It's one that comes up for many of my students who are performing quite well on the corresponding practice test it comes up in. But yeah, this is a GMAT prep official question. All right, any other lingering questions, comments, thoughts for me before I hop off screen? Feel free to jump in with them. Otherwise, I'd be happy to answer any questions, whether you jump them into the chat or into the comments if you happen to not be tuning in live and you're taking a look after the fact. But I will say, I will be rejoining you all on Tuesday to chat a little bit about percents and the common pitfalls that students run into concerning percent questions, and thus the common pitfalls the GMAT sets up concerning percent questions. So I think it's a really fun topic. I hope you guys will join me. Hope to see, again, a couple of familiar faces there at that time. And just want to kind of reiterate that here at Veritas Prep, we do offer very regularly occurring, kind of starting constantly courses, and you're always welcome to join us for a free lesson. I'd love to see you guys in a class coming up soon, and by all means, as you have questions, definitely feel free to ask. So which particular question category to apply? This is a resolve the paradox question. Yeah, so negation, which particular question? Which one do we apply the negation technique? So the negation technique, while I will say, is an absolutely foolproof technique when applied correctly. It applies very primarily to our assumption questions. And so pretty primarily that's where students will apply them on questions. I will say you'll want to make sure that the negation technique is not a substitution for big picture understanding of the questions, for making sure that you recognize and address the gap. However, it can be a good reiteration that you've chosen the correct answer, right? It can be a foolproof way to double check that you're on the right track with the question. And I will say, I've spoken a little bit about the use of the negation technique and where we can kind of route around it in assumption questions in an earlier video if you'd like to check it out. But yeah, once again, thank you guys again for joining me. Looking forward to seeing you again on Tuesday to chat a little bit about percents. Hope to see you guys in a class at some point in the future. Otherwise, happy studying in the meantime, and thanks for having me.